Imagine for a second a force of nature so immense, so incredibly ancient, and so powerful that it has literally shaped the entire destiny of human civilization. Today, we're diving into the longest river in Asia and the third longest in the whole world. It's a waterway that is equal parts creator and destroyer. A muddy, turbulent artery pumping life straight into the very heart of a continent. Welcome to our explainer on the great river of life and death. To really wrap our heads around the scale of what we're dealing with here, just consider this. 1/3. Nearly 1 in 3 people in the entire nation of China live within this single, massive river basin. It is the geographic anchor for hundreds of millions of human lives. It completely drives their industry, their agriculture, and their culture. But, despite its global fame and its overwhelming presence in world history, there's actually a pretty fundamental misunderstanding about this river that we need to clear up right off the bat.
So what is the true name of Asia's longest river? If you went out and asked almost anyone outside of China, they'd probably tell you they confidently know the answer. But honestly, they'd likely be wrong. The name we so widely use in the West is actually the result of this centuries-old historical game of telephone. See, in English, we call it the Yangtze, but that name actually comes from a really old, highly localized ferry crossing down near the lower river delta. When early European arrivals heard this regional name, they basically just mistakenly applied it to the entire river. In Mandarin, the river is known simply and beautifully as Chengjiang, which translates to the Long River. But even that isn't the whole story, right? Because the river's geographic origins are way up in the Tibetan Plateau. Up there, the locals call its upper reaches the Drichu, meaning the water of the female yak. Today, we're going to trace this entire immense journey.
Section 1. Scale of the Great River. The metrics here are just staggering. We're talking about a river that stretches for 6,236 kilometers. Its drainage basin covers a full 1/5 of China's total land area. And economically, the Delta region alone generates a massive 20% of the nation's GDP. It's an absolute economic powerhouse and a physical juggernaut. But actually, it's not just the sheer length of the river that gives it this legendary power.
The really crucial factor here is gravity. Over just the first 2,600 kilometers of its journey, rushing down from the glaciers of the Tangula Mountains, the river plummets a terrifying 5,200 meters in elevation. It drops from way up above 5,000 meters down to less than 1,000 meters before it even reaches the central basin. That sheer vertical plunge generates a kinetic energy that makes the river incredibly treacherous, carving out a natural, deep barrier across the entire landscape.
Because of all that kinetic energy, this river acts as a massive physical wall. Get this, it wasn't until October 16, 2025, that a land vehicle, specifically the Jet Tour Zonheng G700, became the first in history to successfully cross these turbulent waters. And it was a tense 22-minute feat. Just think about that. We're talking about a milestone from 2025 just to conquer this water in a vehicle. For thousands of years, this river wasn't just some helpful resource. It was a completely untamable, uncrossable frontier.
Section 2. Cradle of Southern Culture.
Way before the unified empires we read about today, the lower river was home to the ancient Yue people, and they had some highly distinct traditions. While the northern cultures up along the Yellow River were establishing what we now think of as traditional Chinese customs, the peoples of the Yangtze were living in bamboo groves. They wore their hair short, heavily tattooed their bodies, and even practiced the tradition of blackening their teeth. They were fierce fishers and incredible shipwrights, totally adapted to a life on the water. Human activity here pushes back incredibly far. By the 5th millennium BC, you have the Hemadu culture already cultivating early rice in these fertile wetlands. As we fast forward to the 9th century BC, we see the rise of the powerful swordsmithing states of Wu and Yu. And finally, by 333 BC, the state of Chu managed to annex the region. That united the lower river and set this vital agricultural stage for the massive, unified empires that were about to follow.
Section 3. Battles and borders.
I want you to consider 2 explosive, high-stakes naval clashes that were entirely dictated by the river's sheer width and its violent currents. First, you have the legendary Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 AD, which really cemented the division of the Three Kingdoms. But then, fast forward to the Battle of Kaishi in 1161 AD, the Song dynasty was defending the river against an invading Jin fleet, and they actually used early chemical weapons. They literally fired bombs made of lime and sulfur from trebuchets right onto the enemy warships. The river has always been this intense theater of war, stained by conflict and defended with terrifying ingenuity. Section 4. The Age of Steam. Early navigators used to describe the Three Gorges section of the upper river as a 150-mile passage, which is like the narrow throat of an hourglass. Imagine the entire volume of this massive, raging river suddenly choked into these deep, narrow rock canyons. The result was an absolute nightmare of cross-currents, massive whirlpools, and deadly eddies that threatened to completely crush anything made of wood or iron. So how did they overcome this geography before modern engines? It required sheer, brutal human effort. Early steamships just totally lacked the power to ascend the rapids during the upriver freshets. To keep vital trade moving, they used what were called trackers. Teams of 70 to 80 men were physically hitched to these heavy ropes called hawsers. These guys literally dragged massive ships upriver, fighting the deadly currents step by agonizing step along sheer gorge walls. It's wild to think about, but it wasn't until the year 1900 that a commercial steamer successfully piloted this section under its own power.
Section 5. The power of floods.
3.7 million. That is the upper estimate for the death toll of the 1931 Central China floods. Just let that sink in for a second. Tens of millions of people live in a floodplain that naturally wants to inundate every single summer. When the dikes failed back in 1931, the results were literally apocalyptic. It's generally considered to be among the deadliest natural disasters ever recorded in human history, wiping out millions of lives in one single season of relentless water.
And the water just kept rising in the decades that followed. In 1954, after an unusually long spring rainy season, the river surged again, 44.67. That is the historic height in meters that the floodwaters reached in Jingzhou. Over 44 meters high. The sheer, inescapable volume of that water resulted in an estimated 33,000 deaths, and so many of those were from the devastating plagues and famine that followed in the disaster's aftermath.
Unless we think this is only ancient history, let's look at the damage from a single summer in 1998. $26 billion in economic loss, 15 million people left homeless, 13.3 million houses damaged or totally destroyed. Even with the advent of modern engineering and all these massive dam projects, the river's capacity for catastrophic devastation remains incredibly potent today. Interestingly enough, our modern actions are deeply tied to the river's volatile behavior. In 2020, Yangtze rainfall saw a massive 79% increase compared to the historical 41-year average. So why did this happen? It's a fascinating, kind of counterintuitive climate paradox. During the 2020 pandemic lockdowns, there was a sudden, abrupt reduction in atmospheric aerosols, basically a huge drop in air pollution. Because those aerosols had historically suppressed rainfall over the region, this sudden drop caused a dramatic shift in the climate system, which resulted in violent, historic deluges across the entire river basin. Which leaves us with a pretty dramatic final question to ponder. As sudden emission changes continue to destabilize our fragile climate system, how exactly will human civilization survive the future wrath of the Long River? We've built our lives, our economies, and our deep histories on the muddy banks of the Changjiang. But, as we've seen throughout this explainer, this river is a living, breathing force, one that ultimately yields to absolutely no one. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the world around you.